The mountains did not welcome strangers. Everyone who had ever tried to settle in the high country above Veldmere knew that truth in their bones before they knew it in their minds. The way cold finds the marrow before it finds the skin. The roads that wound upward through the pine corridors were unpaved past a certain elevation, the kind of roads that swallowed tire treads in mud season and disappeared entirely under 4 feet of snow between November and March. And the people who lived in the valleys below had long since stopped asking who owned the old vile cabin at the edge of the Ashwood Ridge, because the answer had always been the same family, and the family had always been the same kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that was not peace, but rather the residue of something that had once been very loud and was now spent. Nora had grown up hearing that description applied to her grandmother first, and then to her mother, and she had not understood it as a child, had resented it slightly, as a teenager, and had arrived at 28 years old, understanding it completely, and not minding it at all. Quiet was what she had come back to the cabin for. Quiet was the only thing she trusted anymore. She had returned in early September, driving a truck loaded with enough supplies to last through the first snowfall, and telling herself that she would reassess after that she was not making a permanent decision, only buying herself time. Time was what grief required more than anything else, she had decided. Not comfort, not company, not the well-meaning casseroles and scheduled check-in calls that her colleagues had offered with genuine kindness when she left the university position in the city. Just time and silence, and the particular mercy of a landscape that did not ask anything of her. The Ashwood Ridge gave her all 3. The pines were old enough to muffle sound in a way that felt deliberate. The nearest town was 40 minutes down the mountain on a good road day. Her closest neighbor was a retired ranger named Aldous, who lived 2 miles east and communicated primarily through occasional firewood deliveries left on her porch without announcement, which Nora had come to regard as the ideal form of human contact. The first time she saw the wolf, she thought she had imagined it. She had been sitting on the porch in the blue hour before full dark, a mug of tea cooling between her palms, watching the tree line the way she had fallen into the habit of watching it. Not looking for anything in particular, but simply letting her eyes rest somewhere that required nothing from them. The light at that hour did strange things to the edges of the forest, softened the boundary between the trunks, so that the shadows pooled and shifted, and occasionally resolved themselves into shapes that dissolved again before she could name them. She had been watching one such shadow when it did not dissolve. It stayed at the margin of the tree line, barely distinguishable from the dark around it, except for the stillness, which was a different quality of stillness than the trees possessed. Trees were still because they had no choice. This thing was still because it had decided to be. It was enormous. That was the first thing she registered, once her eyes adjusted, and she accepted that she was seeing something real. Wolves existed in these mountains. She knew that. The reintroduction program had been running for a decade, and the population had established itself well enough that sightings were no longer rare. But she had seen wolves before, and they had a particular scale to them. A lean, spare architecture that made them look simultaneously larger and smaller than expected. Powerful, but built for distance rather than weight. This animal was built for something else entirely. Its shoulder height, even at the distance she was estimating, which was perhaps 40 yards, was wrong. Too tall, too broad through the chest. The head was lowered in a way that was not quite threatening and not quite submissive, but something between the two that she did not have a word for, a posture of deliberate restraint, as though it was making itself smaller than it was on purpose and not quite succeeding. She did not move. It did not move. The tea finished cooling in her hands, and she did not drink it. And the blue hour deepened into true dark, and at some point in that deepening she blinked, and when she looked again, the tree line was empty. She went inside and stood in her kitchen for several minutes with the lights off, looking out the window at the place where it had been, and then she put the mug in the sink and told herself that the mountain light played tricks and that she needed to sleep. But she did not sleep well that night. And when she woke at 3 a.m. with the particular alertness that was not anxiety but attention, she lay still in the dark and listened, and at the very edge of her hearing, just at the threshold where sound became imagination. She thought she could detect the soft compression of weight on snow. Footsteps, slow and circling, moving around the perimeter of the cabin with a patience that suggested no destination, only the act of moving itself. She lay there and listened for a long time. And then, which surprised her more than the sound had, she fell back asleep. In the morning she found the tracks. They came in from the northeast, from the direction of the deep ashwood where the oldest trees grew, and they circled the cabin in a wide, even orbit, never approaching closer than 30 feet from the walls, and they returned to the northeast before the snow at the tree-line edge had been disturbed enough to tell her which direction they had gone. She crouched over them for a long time in the cold morning air, studying the size of the impressions, pressing her own hand into the snow next to one for scale, and finding the print wider across than her fingers could span. She was not a tracker, and she knew it, but she had enough outdoor sense to understand what she was looking at. The spacing of the strides was long and even and unhurried. This animal had not been running. It had not been hunting. It had been walking, slowly, around her home, in the dark for most of the night, and then it had left. She should have felt afraid. She catalogued the reasons that fear would be the rational response, and found them all present and correct. She had instead a feeling that she did not immediately recognize because she had not felt it in so long, a feeling of being attended to, of existing within someone's careful awareness, that she initially misidentified as loneliness, before she understood it was the opposite. She had felt so unwitnessed for so many months that the sensation of being watched, even by something she could not explain, registered first as a kind of relief. She was disturbed by this conclusion, and spent most of the morning doing practical tasks around the cabin and refusing to examine it further. If you are already feeling something you cannot name, dear listeners, then you understand exactly what Nora felt standing over those tracks in the snow. And if you have ever been so alone that even a mystery felt like company, then this story is yours. Stay with me, because what comes next will answer some questions and deepen others, the way the best mysteries always do. The wolf came back the following night, and the night after that, and every night after that, through the last weeks of September and into October, as the cold settled in properly, and the aspens turned and Nora stopped pretending that she was not watching for it. She developed a routine that she would not have admitted to anyone, though there was no one to admit it to. She began making her tea earlier in the evening, so that she would be on the porch before the blue hour, and she began wearing her heavier coat for the vigil. She also refused to call a vigil, and she began noting small variations in the pattern, which edge of the tree line it emerged from, how long it remained visible before the dark swallowed it, whether it stood or paced or simply stood. Mostly it stood. It stood at the margin of the forest, with that quality of deliberate stillness she had noticed the first night, its attention directed toward her with a focus that should have been unsettling, and was instead, she could not explain this, and gave up trying. Grounding. She felt more solid in herself during those dusk vigils than at any other hour of her days on the mountain. And she was a person who had come to the mountain specifically to find that solidity, and the fact that a wolf was providing it should have alarmed her far more than it did. She talked to it, eventually, not on the first week, but somewhere in the third, when the routine had become established enough that she felt a kind of permission she could not have named either. She would sit on the porch step and hold her cooling mug and say things out loud that she had been holding inside since she had driven up the mountain road in September. She talked about her parents, who had died within 6 months of each other 3 years ago, in the way that sometimes happens with people who have been together long enough that their bodies forget how to sustain themselves independently. She talked about the research position she had left, the years of academic work in folklore and cultural anthropology that had felt urgently meaningful until the morning she sat in her office, staring at a paper she was supposed to be revising, and understood that she did not care about the argument she was making, had perhaps never cared about it, had been caring about the appearing to care, and could not remember when the substance had hollowed out. She talked about the relationship she had ended the previous spring, quietly and without drama, with a man who was good and kind, and with whom she had felt, every single day for 3 years, utterly alone. She had not been able to explain this to him or to herself, and had simply said that she needed time, which was true, and left things there, which was incomplete. The wolf listened. This was the word she used in her own mind, knowing it was not the right word and not finding a better one. It oriented toward her when she spoke. Its ears tracked her voice. And there were nights. Though she recorded these observations with the detached caution of someone who knows she is at the edge of what can be, said without sounding unhinged, when she could have sworn the quality of its stillness changed in response to specific things she said, a kind of intensification around the moments when she got closest to whatever the true shape of her grief was, as though it was paying particular attention to the parts she could barely articulate. October deepened, and the first real snow came. Not the light dusting of late September, but a proper accumulation that arrived on a Tuesday and stayed. And Nora found herself glad for it in a way she had not been glad for anything in a long time, because the snow meant the tracks were more legible in the mornings. She began photographing them. She began keeping notes in the margins of a journal that had originally been designated for personal reflections, filling the margins with stride-length measurements and arrival direction estimates, and the small variations that she charted with more care than she had charted her research data in years. She understood she was doing research. She understood the subject of the research was a wolf that circled her home at night. She understood this was unusual behavior for a field anthropologist, and did not stop. In the 4th week of October, she found something she had not found before. The wolf's usual circuit brought it around the north side of the cabin where the woodpile was stacked. And that morning when she went out to collect wood for the day's fire, she found that the circuit had been interrupted on the north side, or rather that it had been extended. There were tracks leading to a spot at the base of the pines that stood closest to the woodpile, and at that spot there was a depression in the snow that suggested the animal had lain down and stayed for some time, not circling, not passing through, but resting there with a clear sightline to both the cabin door and the approach road. She stood looking at the depression for a long time. It was not a hunting position. It was not the posture of an animal waiting for prey. It was the posture of an animal keeping watch. Something had kept watch over her from that spot. Something very large had chosen the position that gave it the best view of both the way into her home and the way anyone else might approach it, and had lain there in the cold for hours, and had not come closer, and had not left until morning. She pressed her hand into the depression, the way she had pressed it into the first track, measuring the warmth that still, faintly, lingered in the packed snow, and standing there in the cold morning air with her palm against the place where something had rested while she slept, she felt a thing move through her that she did not have a name for either, something older than gratitude and quieter than love and more absolute than either. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid, she understood now, from the first night, and this was perhaps the strangest thing of all, because Nora Vial was a person of reasonable caution and good instincts, a person who had spent 3 years in fieldwork in remote locations, and who trusted her own sense of threat because it had been reliable. Her sense of threat was entirely silent. Whatever this was, whatever it was doing, whatever it wanted from its patient orbiting of her solitude, her oldest and most reliable interior alarm system had assessed it and returned a verdict of safe with a certainty that reason could not touch. She did not know yet that the alarm system was not hers, that it was, in fact, something older than her by several generations, something carried in a bloodline that had been deliberately quieted and had not quite gone silent. She did not know that what she was feeling was not instinct but recognition. She did not know that the wolf knew exactly what she was, had known from the first moment the wind had carried her scent across the ashwood to where he ran his night circuit miles away, had turned without deciding, and come directly to the edge of her clearing and stood there in the dark, simply absorbing the fact of her, the improbable, devastating fact of her existence in this place, at this time, in this form, and had understood, with a clarity that broke something open in a chest that had been closed for a very long time, that everything was about to change. Cassian Voss, Alpha King of the Veldmere territories and sovereign of 17 packs spanning 600 miles of mountain and forest, had not expected to find her. He had not been. looking. This was the detail that would matter later, that would become the cornerstone of everything he tried to explain to her, and to himself. He had not been seeking a mate, had long since made his private peace with the likelihood that the mate bond was simply not part of the life available to him, had organized his existence around duty and governance, and the careful management of a political landscape that required his constant attention. He had been running his night circuit because he ran it every night when he was in the Veldmere territories, because a king who did not know his own borders in his bones was a king who would eventually lose them, and the running cleared him in a way that nothing else did. He had been no one's guardian, and had intended to be no one's guardian. And then the wind had shifted, and she was simply there in it, her scent layered with wood smoke and cold air, and something underneath both that was not human, not quite, something very old and very still, that his blood recognized before his mind caught up. He had not shifted back to human form for 3 weeks. He told himself this was caution, that he needed to understand the situation before he introduced variables, that appearing on a human woman's porch as a man and explaining that he was also the wolf she had been talking to in the evenings was not a plan with a high likelihood of a favorable outcome. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the wolf form allowed him a simplicity of purpose that his human form could not sustain. In the wolf there was only the watching, only the perimeter, only the steady work of ensuring that nothing came near her that meant harm, and there was no requirement to think beyond that or to acknowledge what it meant, or to confront the fact that he was doing something that the Cassian of 6 months ago would have found incomprehensible. A king did not haunt a woman's clearing for weeks. A king did not lie in the snow outside her woodpile to watch her door. A king did not reorganize his entire circuit schedule around the hours when she sat on her porch and spoke her sadnesses into the cold air in a voice so quiet and unperformed that he understood he was hearing things she had never said to another living person. He was doing all of these things, and he was, though he would be slow to admit this, grateful for each one. The world he governed was not a peaceful one, or rather, it was peaceful in the way that anything, held under sufficient pressure, becomes temporarily still. The stillness of suppression, rather than the stillness of resolution. The 17 packs of the Veldmere territories had not been at open war in a generation, but the political architecture of that peace was maintained by a constant and exhausting system of negotiation, alliance management, and the careful application of authority that his father had built and that he had inherited and expanded. And the cost of it was a particular loneliness that he had accepted as structural to his position. You could not be close to people over whom you had absolute authority without that authority distorting everything. He had people who served him faithfully, and people who feared him, and people who maneuvered around him, and people who genuinely respected what he had built. And none of these relationships, however good, had ever given him the experience of simply being known, of having his actual self, not the sovereign, not the alpha, king, not the political entity that his name had become, simply witnessed by someone who wanted nothing from him. He had found this, improbably, in the form of a woman on a porch who did not know he existed, speaking to an animal she had decided was safe for reasons she could not explain. He was not going to examine how much this mattered to him. Not yet. The event that made his extended silence impossible was, like most forcing functions, something that came from outside his control. In the second week of November, a hunting party from the Greyvale pack crossed into the Ashwood territory on a route that brought them within 2 miles of Nora's cabin, which was 2 miles closer than Cassian was willing to permit. The Greyvale pack was not hostile, exactly, but its current leadership was ambitious in the way of packs whose territory bordered a resource-rich region they did not control, and its scouts had been testing the Ashwood boundary for months in ways that were deniable, individually, and unmistakable in aggregate. He had been managing this diplomatically, and would continue to do so. But diplomacy was a language conducted at a distance, and he was not at a distance. He was 3 miles from where 3 Greyvale wolves were moving through terrain that put them on a path past the only unprotected human for a significant radius. And that human was not just a human. He drove them back before they came within a mile of her, appeared on the ridge above their route in wolf form and let them see him, which was sufficient. No Alpha King in his right mind was going to miss that signal. The Greyvale wolves turned south immediately, and with more speed than dignity, which would create a political conversation he would need to manage later. And he marked the ridge afterward with the definitiveness of someone establishing a point he intended to be understood at maximum clarity. Then he returned to the cabin's perimeter, and resumed his circuit, and stood at the tree line until the light came back up, and she appeared on her porch with her tea, and said good morning to him in that quiet voice. And something in him that had been tight since he had spotted the Greyvale tracks went soft again. But he had known, driving the hunting party back, that he had stepped into the territory of active intervention, in a way that the passive circling of previous weeks had not quite constituted. He had made himself a participant, and a participant who spent weeks establishing silent vigils and then refused to introduce himself, was not conducting himself with the honesty that he believed, genuinely and not just politically, a king owed to his territory. He owed her an explanation. He had known this for some time, and had been, in a manner entirely unlike him, avoiding it. The snowstorm that arrived on the 15th of November did not care about his avoidance. Nora had known the storm was coming, because she followed the weather reports with the diligence of someone who lived alone at elevation and understood that being unprepared was a different category of problem in the mountains than it was in cities. She had stocked the woodpile and checked the generator and brought in the outdoor furniture that could become projectile in high wind, and she had settled in by early afternoon with the storm already visible on the western horizon as a purple darkness that the light bent away from. She had been reading for 2 hours, the storm beginning to sound against the windows when she heard the knock at the door. She went very still, not because she was frightened, though she should have been. Alone on a mountain in a snowstorm with no close neighbors and no expectation of visitors. She went still because she recognized, in the quality of the knock, something that was also in the quality of the stillness she had watched for weeks at her tree line. Deliberate restraint, weight held carefully back from its own scale. 3 knocks, even. Unhurried. And then silence. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was drenched. The storm had escalated faster than expected in the last hour, and he had clearly been caught in the transition from the cold, driving rain to the full whiteout conditions that were now reducing visibility to perhaps 10 feet beyond the porch railing, and he stood in several inches of accumulated snow without appearing to notice either the cold or the wet, in a way that she clocked immediately as unusual because noticing the cold was involuntary. It was physiological. And this man's body was simply not registering it. He was tall in a way that altered her sense of the porch's dimensions, broad through the shoulder, in a way she recognized before she understood she recognized it, with dark hair plastered to his face by the wet, and eyes that were a gray, so dark they were nearly black, and that were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize because it contained, simultaneously, things that did not usually coexist: certainty and apology, absolute recognition, and something that looked, strangely, like relief. She said, "You should come in." She did not know why she said it. It was the right thing to say to someone standing in a blizzard on her porch, obviously, but she had said it before she ran the rational calculation, before she asked herself who he was, or how he had reached her cabin in these conditions, or why a stranger was on her mountain at all. She said it because something in her recognized something in him in a way that bypassed the part of her that asked questions, and she was aware of this bypass happening and found, standing in her open doorway with the storm roaring around them both, that she did not want to argue with it. He came in. He stood on her mat and dripped while she closed the door against the wind and turned to look at him properly, and he met her gaze with that impossible combination of certainty and apology, and waited. He was. She understood, giving her the moment, not filling it, not rushing past it, waiting for her to arrive at whatever she was going to arrive at. She said, "It's you." He said, "Yes." His voice was low and even, and carried the same quality as the stillness at her tree line, something that was very large making itself careful. He said yes in the tone of someone acknowledging a truth that had been established before this conversation and would continue after it. A yes that was not a claim, but a confirmation, she said. How long? He said. Since the first night in September. She absorbed this. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Not because tea was what the situation called for, but because the act of filling the kettle gave her a moment with her back to him in which to arrange herself. And she had discovered over months of solitude that she was, at root, a person who needed small physical tasks during large interior moments. She heard him remain exactly where he was, not following her, not moving, simply waiting with that extraordinary patience that she now understood was not an animal's patience, but a person's choice. She said from the kitchen, "Why?" He said, "Because you were there. Because I knew what you were. Because I could not leave you unprotected once I knew." She turned around. She looked at him across the small distance of her open-plan cabin interior and said, "What do I mean by that? What am I?" He looked at her for a moment, and the look contained an attention so complete that she felt it physically. Felt it the way you feel the sun come out when you have been standing in shadow. A warmth that was directional and specific, and entirely unlike ambient warmth. He said, "May I sit down first? It is a long answer and I would prefer to give it to you properly." She pulled out the chair across from where she would sit and he took it, and she made the tea and brought both mugs and sat across from him. And outside the storm pressed itself. Against every surface of the cabin, and inside there was the fire and the light, and 2 mugs of tea, and a man who was also a wolf, sitting across from a woman who had been talking to him in the dark for 2 months. And Nora thought, with a clarity that she found remarkable given the circumstances, that she was not afraid. She was many other things, but she was not afraid. He told her about the packs first. He explained the structure of the Veldmere territories in the way she later understood was characteristic of him, beginning with the architecture rather than his own position within it, giving her the frame before the picture. And she listened with the same quality of attention she had been developing for months on this mountain, the kind that had no agenda in it. He explained the Alpha system, the hierarchy of pack governance, the way territory was defined and defended and negotiated across generations. He explained the mate bond, not as a mystical thing, though there was mysticism in it, but as a biological and social reality, a recognition that operated beneath conscious choice and had enormous consequences for everyone it touched. He explained this last point with what she would come to recognize as characteristic care, making sure she understood that the bond was not compulsion, that it was recognition rather than control, that knowing it existed did not mean she owed anything to it or to him, that he was not sitting across from her in her kitchen explaining his nature, in order to claim her, but because she deserved to know the truth of what had been happening outside her home for 2 months. He was, she thought, extraordinarily careful with her autonomy for someone who could have handled this situation in any number of less considerate ways. This was worth noting. Then he said, "Your family name." She said, "Vile." He said, "Vile is a corruption of an older word. The original form was Vialthari. It means, in the oldest territorial language, the one who holds the threshold." He paused, and the pause had weight in it. "It was the designation given to the guardian bloodline." She said, "Tell me what that means." And he did. He told her about the Vialthari, the lineage that had run alongside the pack world for longer than the pack histories could accurately record. A bloodline that was not wolf, but was not entirely human either. Something that had developed in the long coexistence between early human communities and the pack territories. A line of people who carried, dormant in their blood, the ability to perceive and interact with the supernatural world in ways that ordinary humans could not. They had been, in the old structure, intermediaries. Diplomats, in a sense, between the human settlements and the packs, people trusted by both because they were, at some essential level, comprehensible to both. They had carried a passive protective field, an emanation that was not magic in the performative sense, but something more like a deep, structural coherence, a quality that unsettled predators, that bent bad weather, that made the ground they stood on feel different. He had felt it the moment her scent had reached him. He had known immediately what he was sensing because he had studied the old records, had made the old bloodlines his particular scholarly interest in the years when he had believed the Vaelthari were simply history. They had been suppressed. He said this with a flatness that she understood contained a great deal of anger held at professional distance. Not destroyed, because the bloodline had proven harder to eradicate than the council faction that had attempted it 3 generations ago had anticipated. But the active carrying families had been targeted and scattered, their connections to the pack world severed, their own knowledge of what they were withheld from them until the dormancy became so deep it was functionally indistinguishable from absence. Nora's grandmother had known. Her mother had been told a version that was incomplete enough to be useless. Nora had been told nothing. She sat with this for a long time. The storm spoke against the windows, and the fire popped, and she sat with the mug between both hands, the way she had held her mug on the porch, through all those October evenings, and she thought about her mother, who had been a restless woman, brilliant and unsettled, who had worked 3 different careers and moved 6 times, and never seemed to arrive anywhere that fit her, and she thought about her grandmother, who had lived in this very cabin and had been called the quiet kind in the way her family always applied to women who were actually very loud inside and had learned to contain it, and she thought about herself, about every job that had not fit, and every relationship that had not fit, and every city she had passed through without ever feeling that she was staying, and the thing that moved through her was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but some alloy of both that she did not have a word for. She said, "Why did it need to be awakened? Why couldn't it just be dormant?" He said, "Because the Grey Veil Pack is not the only faction testing the Ashwood border, and because the force that suppressed the Vaelthari 3 generations ago has successors who are aware that the bloodline was not fully eliminated, who have been, for the last 5 years, trying to locate the remaining carriers." He held her gaze. "I found you before they did. This was not accidental. I was looking specifically to find you before they could," she said. "You said the bond wasn't compulsion," he said. "It isn't," she said. "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved in the grate. He said, "It is the most honest thing I have ever felt in my life, which I'm aware is not a satisfying answer to someone who has just learned they carry a suppressed supernatural bloodline and has been watched by a wolf for 2 months without being informed of any of this. I am not offering it as justification. I am offering it as the truth." She looked at him for a long time, and he let her look, and did not arrange his face into anything that was not exactly what was there. She thought, this is a person who has spent a great deal of time being looked at by people who wanted something from him, and he has learned to let himself be looked at without flinching, and there is something in the way he is sitting across from me right now that is different from the way a person sits when they are managing an interaction. He is not managing this. He is simply present in it. She said, "You stayed in wolf form for 2 months." He said, "Yes," she said, "because..." He was quiet again. Then, "Because it was simpler. In the wolf there was only one thing to do. In this form there are considerably more questions, and I was not ready to face all of them. This is not something I typically admit. You should know it is true." She almost smiled. It was the first thing, approaching a smile that had moved across her face in a very long time, and she felt it happen the way you feel a muscle engage that you had forgotten you had. She said, "I talked to you." He said, "I know." She said, "You listened." He said very quietly, "I have never listened to anything so carefully in my life." If you are watching this and thinking you understand what it means to be truly heard, dear listeners, to have your real voice, the one underneath all your performances and adjustments, received by someone who is simply and entirely present for it, then you understand what happened in that kitchen during that storm. And if you have never felt it, if you are sitting somewhere wondering what it would take to be known that way, then I need you to stay with this story, because it is going to show you what comes after the moment of recognition, what you have to do with it, what it costs, what it's worth. He stayed through the storm because the storm lasted 4 days, and Leaving was not a practical option, which was either the mountain's interference or coincidence depending on your relationship to the idea that the world occasionally arranges things. They established a protocol with the ease of two people who are both, at their cores, organized and self-sufficient and not interested in conflict about small things. He took the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. She kept the main one. She cooked because she had the supplies and the system, and he cleaned up. Afterward, with a thoroughness that suggested extensive practice or very high standards or both, they spoke in the evenings. In the mornings, they were largely quiet, moving around each other in the kitchen with the careful spatial awareness of two large personalities in a small space. And this, too, was easy in a way that should have been surprising. She asked him about the council. He told her, with the careful precision of someone who had been navigating politics long enough to be able to discuss them clearly without being inflammatory about it, about the High Council that governed relations between the packs and had, in the current configuration, a faction within it that had been consistently opposed to the restoration of Valthari recognition. He gave her the history without editorializing and let her draw her own conclusions, which she did, and which were not favorable to the faction in question. She asked him what restoring her bloodline would mean, politically, and he explained that it would mean a renegotiation of the governance structure that had prevailed since the suppression, one that would be fiercely resisted by the interests that had benefited from the absence of Valthari intermediaries. She said, "You're the Alpha King. Can't you just establish the new structure?" He said, "I could establish it. Establishing it in a way that holds across all 17 packs and does not create a split that undoes 30 years of territorial peace requires more than authority. It requires something that is currently missing from the equation." She said, "Which is?" He said, "Proof. A living, awakened Valthari who can demonstrate the bloodline's function, who cannot be dismissed as a political fabrication or a pretender. The High Council operates on evidence and consensus among the senior alphas. Without a Valthari who can be witnessed doing what the bloodline does, the claim that it should be recognized is theoretical, and theoretical claims against deeply entrenched interests do not succeed." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You need me." He said, "Yes." She said, "You needed me before you found me." He said, "Yes. Though I want to be precise about this because I think the precision matters to you. I needed a Valthari for the political situation before I found you. What I feel now is not reducible to that need, and I would have those feelings if the political situation did not exist, and the political situation does not create an obligation on your part. These three things are all true simultaneously." She studied him. She said, "You're very careful." He said, "I have a great deal of power. People with a great deal of power who are not careful cause a great deal of damage. I made my peace with this constraint a long time ago." She said, "It's not a constraint if it's a value." He looked at her in a way that was very still and very complete, and said, "No, you're right. It isn't." The storm released them on the 4th day. The sky came back blue and absolute, and the snow lay deep across everything, and the ashwood stood in its white silence, and Cassian helped her dig out the porch and the path to the woodpile, with an efficiency that she suspected was related to being substantially stronger than an average human, and did not comment on. They stood afterward looking out at the ridge and the clean white expanse, and she said, "I need time." He said, "I know." She said, "Not because I don't believe you, or because I'm afraid. I believe you about all of it, which is strange enough on its own. I need time, because I'm still the person who came up this mountain in September, and I need to understand who I'm becoming before I make decisions from that place." He nodded. He said, "I will continue to be here, in whatever form is useful. You have my number now." They had exchanged numbers on the 2nd day, with the practicality of two people who recognized that communication was going to be necessary, regardless of what else was, or wasn't decided. "You don't have to make any decisions about any of it. The political situation is manageable. You are not in immediate danger. I would like you to not be alone up here indefinitely, but I am not in a position to require that of you, and I would not try." She said, "But," he said, but the people who are looking for the bloodline will find the trail eventually. I have obscured it as much as possible, and I am not without resources for continuing to do so. But eventually is still a real word. She looked at the ridge. She said, "How eventually?" He said, "Months, not years." She nodded. She said, "All right." He shifted back at the tree line, and she watched it happen with the calm of someone who had already accepted more impossible things in 4 days than most people accept in a lifetime. And then the enormous gray wolf stood at the forest margin and looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back and said, "I'll call you." And he dipped his head once in a gesture. That was so precisely like a nod that she would have laughed if she hadn't also felt it in the center of her sternum. And then he was gone into the ashwood. She stood on the clean white porch in the clean blue morning and held her own elbows in her palms and thought, all right then. She called him 6 days later. Not about the political situation, not about the bloodline or the council faction or the Greyvale border tests. She called him because it was evening and she was sitting on the porch with her tea, and the tree line was empty for the first time in 2 months, and she found that she had things to say that required a listener. And the listener she wanted was specific. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I'm on the porch." He said, "I know." She said, "How?" He said, with what she was beginning to identify as his version of humor, which was dry and sparing, and delivered with complete seriousness, "The wind." She laughed. It came out of her before she could assess. A real laugh, not the polite or performed variety, but the kind that belongs to a moment that has caught you genuinely off guard, and it felt like the first clean breath after a very long time of shallow ones. She heard, in the silence after it, something that might have been a long exhalation on his end, something that sounded like the release of something held. They talked for 2 hours. This became the pattern of the weeks that followed, as November gave way to December, and the mountain settled into its deepest winter. Conversations in the evenings, sometimes long and ranging across everything, sometimes short and largely quiet on both ends, comfortable silences that she had not experienced in a phone call before, and that she suspected were not typical for him either. He told her about the governance work, not the political strategy, but the texture of it, the small daily negotiations that constituted the actual work of keeping 17 packs in functional relationship. She told him about the folklore research she had been slowly returning to, not the academic framework she had been performing in the university context, but the actual underlying questions she had always cared about, the ones about how human cultures remembered encounters with the supernatural, what those memories preserved, and what they distorted, and what they might be pointing toward. She was beginning to understand, spectacularly well-positioned to pursue those questions with a depth that her academic career had not had access to, for reasons that had recently become clear. He came back to the cabin in the second week of December, in human form, on a day when the weather was reasonable, driving a truck that was better equipped for mountain roads than hers was. He brought supplies she hadn't asked for but did need, and a box of books from a private collection that he said she would find relevant to the research questions she had mentioned. And he left both on the porch when she didn't answer the door in the first 30 seconds, which she appreciated enough to tell him so. She had been in the back room trying to finish a thought. He had left the things and was back in his truck when she came out, and she stood on the porch and looked at him through the windshield and made a gesture whose meaning was clear, and he came inside. He stayed for dinner. She made something simple with what she had, and he sat at the table and read one of the books he had brought while she cooked, and the domestic ordinariness of it landed in her chest like something that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it, the particular ache of something being exactly right in a way that underscores how often things have been wrong. She did not say this. She put the food on the table and he closed the book and they ate. And afterward he washed up and she dried and they did not talk much and did not need to. And she thought, I have lived alone for 3 years and been lonely for most of them, and I am not lonely right now in this kitchen with this person, and the difference is enormous, and I am going to need some time with it. He left before dark. He always left before dark unless the weather made leaving impossible. She had noticed this and understood it as consideration. He was not creating a situation in which she felt obligated to offer him what she had not yet decided to offer. She appreciated it in the way she was coming to appreciate many of his choices, with the recognition that consideration was not the same as distance, that you could be careful with someone and still be fully present with them, that restraint in the right circumstances was not withholding, but respect. She understood, in the process of doing something she had not done in a very long time, which was falling. She was not afraid of this, which was its own kind of progress. Are you still with me, dear listeners? Because I need you to be here for this next part, for the part where the outside world arrives and changes the shape of everything, the way it always does when people are in the middle of becoming something. Hit that like button if you're staying, because we are nowhere near done. The contact came in the first week of January, and it did not come in the form Cassian had expected. He had expected the High Council faction to move through official channels first, to make their approach through the political architecture in which they had always operated, and he had prepared accordingly. What he had not adequately prepared for was a direct contact to Nora through channels that bypassed him entirely, because he had not known until too late that the faction had resources within the human world that were older and more established than his intelligence suggested. The woman who appeared at the bottom of Nora's mountain road in a car that was too clean for those conditions was named Sora, and she presented herself as a researcher from an academic foundation that Nora had, in fact, heard of, and she said she had found Nora's name in connection with some archival materials the foundation had recently acquired, and wondered if Nora might be willing to consult. Nora had not yet read all the books Cassian had left her. She had not yet reached the section that described, in specific detail, the methods by which the suppression campaign had historically made first contact with Velthari individuals they wanted to neutralize. She had not yet understood that the academic framing was characteristic, and had been used before, and had worked before because Velthari carriers in the dormant state were often, for reasons related to their own suppressed nature seeking expression, drawn to folklore and cultural memory work, and were therefore professionally available to exactly this kind of approach. She was courteous to the woman, and did not invite her to the cabin and said she would think about it, and took the card. She called Cassian before she reached the top of the road again. He was at the cabin by evening, which given the distance meant he had driven fast and not entirely within posted limits. He came through the door with a controlled urgency that she recognized as his version of alarmed, which was not a raised voice or a dramatic entrance, but a particular quality of directness, all unnecessary motion stripped away, that she had come to read accurately over the preceding months. He looked at the card she handed him. He said, "I know this. Foundation. It is a legal entity that exists on paper. The actual organization it represents is not an academic institution." She said, "The Council faction." He said, "The Council faction's operational arm in the human world. They use it to manage information about the supernatural world that surfaces in human academic and journalistic contexts. They have been doing this for longer than either of our lifetimes." He set the card down. "They know where you are." She said, "You said months." He said, "I was wrong." Or they accelerated their timeline. Either is possible. He looked at her. "You need to come down from the mountain, Nora." She had known this moment was coming. She had been preparing for it in the way she prepared for things, which was to sit with the idea for a long time before it arrived, so that when it arrived, she had already done the grief work of the previous life, and could move without being pulled backward into it. She looked around her cabin, at the kitchen where they had eaten together, and the porch where she had talked to a wolf in the dark, and the window that showed the tree line and the ridge and the blue winter sky, and she felt the love of the place, and the love of what it had given her, and she said, "I know." He said, "There is a safe house in the valley territory that I control directly. It is comfortable and well supplied, and you would have complete privacy. It is not indefinite. It is a base while we work the political situation." She said, "We." He met her eyes. He said, "If you want to be. You are under no obligation. I can arrange protection that does not require your participation in any of the governance work." She thought about what he had said months ago, about needing a living, awakened Velthari, about proof as the missing element. She thought about her research and what it meant now that she understood herself to be not just a scholar of this world, but a member of it by bloodline, by whatever the dormant and waiting thing in her blood was, by a heritage that had been stolen from her, with the deliberate intention of preventing exactly the kind of contribution she might make. She thought about her mother's restlessness and her grandmother's silence and the accumulated cost of 3 generations of women who had known something was theirs and had it kept from them. She said, "Tell me what awakening the bloodline actually involves." His expression shifted. It was subtle, and she could read it now, had been learning to read the small variations of his usually still face with the same care she had tracked the wolf's positions and the snow's impressions, and what she read was something that was not relief exactly, but was the thing that lives beside relief. He said, "It involves the formal recognition by the Alpha King, which is a ceremonial act with real biological consequence. It reactivates the dormant markers in the bloodline and allows the Vailthari function to begin operating consciously rather than passively. You have already been experiencing the passive version, the quality of safety you feel in the mountains, the way predators avoid your territory, the sense that weather events have a different relationship to your immediate space." She said, "The storm that came from the west bent around the cabin twice this winter." He said quietly, "Yes, that was you." She sat with this. She said, "And the recognition, what does it require from you?" He said, "My witness, my deliberate and conscious acknowledgement of what you are, spoken in the formal language of the old compact between the pack world and the Vailthari. It is not a binding act for you. It does not create obligation or claim. It is recognition in the pure sense, a statement of what is true." She said, "And for you." He was quiet. The winter light lay across the table between them. He said, "For me, it formalizes something that has already been true since September. It is, in the ceremonial language, a declaration before the pack world that you are under the sovereign protection of the Alpha King, which means that anyone who moves against you moves against my authority directly, which changes the political calculus for the faction in ways that make their options considerably narrower." He paused. "It also means, in the older language that the ceremony uses, something that I would have you understand before you make any decisions about any of this." She said, "Tell me." He said, "In the older language it is not separable from acknowledgement of the mate bond. The ceremony was designed for a context in which the Vailthari and the Alpha King were understood to be, in the natural order of things, each other's. I can perform the recognition without believing it to be a ceremony of binding, and the political effect will be the same. But I would be dishonest if I told you I could perform it without knowing what it also means." The room was very still. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and outside the mountain went about its ancient business of being enormous and old and indifferent, and inside there were 2 people who had spent months arriving at this point by the most cautious route either of them was capable of. And she thought, "I have been alone in this cabin since September, and I have not been lonely since October. And the difference is entirely this person sitting across from me. And I am not afraid of what he just said, which tells me something important." She said, "I know what it means." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know what it means because I have known since the night you came to my door in the storm, which is not something I was prepared to say out loud before now, but which is true." He said nothing. But his face, which she had learned to read, said a great deal. It said something that was too large for the careful and restrained expression he typically wore, something that lived below the governance and the sovereignty and the political intelligence, something that was very simply a person who had been alone in a particular way for a very long time, and had found the specific other who made that particular aloneness impossible to return to. She said, "I'll come down from the mountain, and I would like to hear the ceremony." They left the next morning. The cabin closed up properly against the winter. The fire banked. The tracks in the snow that had recorded 2 months of a wolf's patient vigil already beginning to soften in the January thaw. She took what she needed and left what could be retrieved later, and got in her truck, and he got in his. and she followed his headlights down the mountain road, watching the way the ridge receded in her rearview mirror, thinking about thresholds and the people who hold them and what it meant to finally understand yourself to be one. The safe house in the valley was everything he had described, and she did not care very much about it, because the first thing that happened after they arrived was that she stood in the living room that was clean and warm and adequately stocked, and he stood across from her and said, in a language that was not any language she consciously knew, but that she understood the way she understood her own heartbeat, the words of the formal recognition. They were not long. They were very old. They described, in the stripped and precise language of something that had been refined over centuries of use, what she was and what he was, and what it meant that they were in the same place at the same time, and that he knew her name, and she had heard his, which in the old compact was the sufficient condition for everything that followed. And as he spoke, she felt the thing that had been dormant in her blood begin to move. Not violently, not explosively, but the way roots move when the thaw comes. A slow and inarguable finding of direction. A reaching toward what had always been the direction even when the reaching was impossible. She felt the mountain quality leave her slightly and restructure itself, become something more mobile, something that moved with her rather than residing in a fixed geography. And she understood this was the bloodline coming awake into a form that would be useful in the world she was about to move through. When he finished, she said, "I felt it." He said, "I know. I felt it too." She said, "What does it feel like from your side?" He said, "Like the completion of something I had been carrying, without knowing its shape." He paused. Like someone lighting a room I had been navigating in the dark for long enough that I had forgotten rooms could be lit. She crossed the small distance between them, and he met her halfway, and she thought, with a clarity that was the clearest thing she had ever thought, that this was exactly what it felt like to arrive somewhere. Now, dear listeners, if you have been holding your breath, you can release it, but I need you to stay, because the arrival is not the end of the story. The arrival is where the real work begins. The council faction moved faster than the political timeline Cassian had projected, which he later attributed to the recognition ceremony itself. The Vialthari awakening was perceptible to sensitive pack members across a significant radius, and the faction had people who were specifically watching for it, which meant that the window between the ceremony and the faction's response was shorter than either of them had planned for. They had perhaps 3 weeks before the formal challenge would arrive through council channels, and the challenge, when it came, would need to be answered on council ground. They used the 3 weeks. Nora used them in the way she used time when the stakes were real, which was with complete focus and no wasted effort. She read the books, all of them, and the additional materials Cassian provided from the archives he controlled, and she built a map in her mind of the political landscape that was both analytically rigorous and informed by things she was beginning to understand. She had always been able to sense patterns in social structures and loyalties, and the distribution of power that she could now perceive with a directness that had previously been intuition and was now something more like knowledge. Cassian watched her working and said, once, "You are very good at this." And she said, "I know. I always wondered why." And he smiled, which was the version of his face that she was most interested in, and that appeared most reliably in her company and not, she understood from context, in many others. She met the senior alphas who were his allies in the governance structure, and she did this with a care and intentionality that impressed them in ways she could see them trying not to show, which amused her. She was introduced as Vialthari by bloodline and by the Alpha King's recognition, and the reaction varied. Some of the older alphas responded with a recognition of their own, a reaching towards something in the old histories that their blood remembered even when their conscious knowledge was incomplete. Some of the younger leadership was skeptical in the way of people whose political interests lay with the prevailing order. She was patient with all of them. Patience was, she was discovering, not just a personality trait, but a bloodline function. A deep structural willingness to wait for what was real to surface, because she could feel it was there even when it was not yet visible. She was, she understood, extraordinary. She had always known this in the way of people who suspect their own capacities, but have not had the conditions to confirm them, and the confirmation, when it came, was quieter than she had expected, less a revelation than a recognition. Oh, she thought, so that's what this has been. The formal council challenge arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Cassian brought it to her directly, not managing it before she saw it, which she had been watching for and appreciated. She read it, and he watched her. Read it, and she said, "They're claiming the recognition was invalid because there is no established Valthari bloodline to recognize. They're saying I'm a pretender." He said, "Yes." She said, "But you have the genealogical records." He said, "I have records they will challenge as fabricated. The council faction has held the official archive for 70 years. The counter-archive I maintain is real and complete, but is not, in council procedure, the official record." She said, "So the evidence. Argument is circular. They control what counts as evidence." He said, "Which is why I told you in September that proof was the missing piece. Records can be disputed. A living demonstration cannot." She said, "What does a living demonstration look like?" He told her. She listened. And then she said, with the quietness of someone who has arrived at the place they have been walking toward for a long time, "I can do that." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not afraid." He said, "I know that too. I've known it since the first night you sat on your porch and watched a wolf come out of the dark and decided, before you had any information, that you were safe." She said, "I had information. I had the information my blood was giving me. I just didn't know that's what it was." He said, "Yes." The council convened in the hall of the Veldmere territory seat, which was not the castle of fantasy, but a large and old building set into the mountainside that had the quality of having grown there, over time rather than been built, its stones the same gray as the winter sky, its rooms carrying the particular accumulated weight of many decisions made and many things said and unsaid across many generations. Nora walked into it with Cassian on her left and 3 senior allied alphas flanking them, and thought about her grandmother, walking into a room in a world that had locked her out of herself, and thought about her mother moving from place to place, looking for the thing she could sense but couldn't name, and thought about herself on a porch in the dark talking to the tree line, and thought, this is for them too. The challenge had drawn the full council, which was 17 senior representatives and their aides, and the faction that had brought the challenge was seated to the right of the central table, and their lead representative was a man named Aldrich, who had the bearing of someone who had been in authority for long enough to have become the authority, who looked at her when she entered with an assessment that was practiced and unimpressed, and who was, she could feel it immediately, genuinely afraid of her, which was why the unimpressed bearing was being worked so hard. She let him see that she felt it. This was not a tactical choice, but simply accuracy, a refusal to perform a confidence she did not feel in order to reassure someone who was performing a confidence he did not feel, which seemed in this context like the exact wrong approach. She let him see that she knew he was afraid, and she watched the calculation move across his face as he tried to determine what to do with being known. Cassian made the formal presentation of the recognition and the genealogical evidence and the counter-archive in the form that council procedure required, and Aldrich's team made their formal challenge, and there was a period of procedural argument that Nora listened to with the same quality of attention she had given everything in the last months, the kind with no ego in it, the kind that was just listening. And at the point in the proceedings when the challenge faction's position had been made as strongly as procedure allowed, she was recognized by Cassian to speak. She stood up. She did not begin with argument. She did not begin with the genealogical evidence or the historical record or the political case for Valthari restoration. She began with a single thing that she had understood, in the weeks of reading and meeting and preparation, was the actual center of everything. She let the bloodline speak. It was not a performance. She did not have words for exactly what she did, though she would later work with the Pack scholars to develop a more precise vocabulary for it. She simply stopped holding it still, stopped the habitual interior quieting that she now understood, had been the trained response to the suppression, the thing her grandmother had learned and her mother had inherited, and she had carried without knowing it was not hers, and she let the Valthari function do what it had always been built to do. The room responded, not dramatically, not with visible light or perceptible sound, but with a shift in the quality of attention that moved through the council members in a wave, beginning with the oldest alphas who had the most ancestral memory, and spreading outward. A shift that was not suggestibility but recognition, the blood of the pack world remembering the blood of the bloodline it had always known. There were council members on the floor who had no position on the challenge one way or the other, who put their hands flat on the table as though finding something solid, not distressed, just grounding themselves in the presence of something very old. There were senior alphas who looked at each other with expressions that required no translation. There was Aldrich, whose face she watched while she kept the bloodline open, who went through several recognizable stages of a person confronting the evidence against the position they have built their power on, and who did not do what she had halfway expected, which was to double down. He looked at her and he saw, and then he looked at the council floor, and he saw what was on their faces, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that had lost its performed authority and become simply a man's voice, "The recognition stands." The room exhaled. Cassian, beside her, was perfectly still. She looked at him, and he looked back, and what was in his face was something she would spend a long time finding the right word for, and eventually settle on the word whole, because it was the face of a person who was carrying everything they needed to be carrying, and nothing they should not be. A person whose hands were empty of pretense. The formal restoration of Valthari standing took 3 more months of procedural work, because political restructuring always takes 3 more months of procedural work, and Nora did that work with the same focused patience she brought to everything, and Cassian worked alongside her with the collaborative ease of a person who had been waiting to work alongside someone without having known they were waiting, and the senior alphas who had been his oldest allies became her allies too, and some of the people who had been skeptical or opposed became less so, as the Valthari function demonstrated, in small daily ways, its practical value in the governance work. She was good at it. She was, frankly, remarkable at it. And she was, which perhaps surprised her more than anything else, deeply happy in a way that was structural rather than circumstantial. A happiness that did not depend on everything going well, because the root of it was simply that she was doing what she was made to do in the company of the specific person she was made to be in the company of, which was, she understood, a rarer condition than the world's available vocabulary for it suggested. She called Aldous the retired ranger in early spring to tell him she would be away from the cabin for a while, and was surprised to discover, in the conversation that followed, that he had known the Vale family for 30 years, and had suspected, though he lacked the framework to name it, that the women in it carried something unusual. He said, "Your grandmother used to sit on that porch and the deer would come out of the woods and stand right at the edge and she'd just look at them. Never tried to feed them. They'd stand there 20 minutes sometimes and then go back in." He paused. "Never saw that with anyone else," she said. "She was the threshold." He said, "Reckon she was." And then, with the economy of a man who had communicated primarily through firewood deliveries for several decades. "Glad you found what you were looking for," she said. "I wasn't looking," he said. Best things rarely need looking for. She did go back to the cabin in the late spring, with Cassian, who had not been there since the January morning. They had driven down together. They opened it in the particular way of a place being readied for use rather than storage. All the windows open to let the season in. The porch swept. The fire laid for the evening. She stood on the porch in the late afternoon light and looked at the tree line and the place where she had first seen the wolf, and she thought about the person she had been in September, who had come up the mountain with grief and no direction and a deep conviction that the quiet was what she needed. And she thought about how the quiet had been right, but the aloneness had been wrong, and she thought that this distinction was perhaps the most important thing she had learned, and that she might not have understood it without both the aloneness first and the company second. Cassian came out with tea and sat beside her on the step, and they looked at the tree line together, and he said, after a while, "Do you miss it?" She said, "The quiet?" He said, "The simplicity. Before all of this." She thought about it honestly, because he had earned honest answers about everything, and she had learned to give them. She said, "I miss the version of me that was finally alone enough to start being honest with herself. But that version needed what came after her to make sense. So no, I don't miss it. I live in the consequence of it." He said, "That's a good way to put it." She said, "I have my moments." He said, "You have considerably more than moments." And the warmth in his voice was the same warmth as a room being lit from the inside, specific and directional and nothing like ambient. And she leaned against his shoulder on the porch step in the late spring evening, while the tree line held its ancient silence, and the ashwood breathed around them, and the mountain went on being enormous and old. And finally, for the first time since her grandmother had sat here watching deer emerge from the same trees, attended to by one of its own. If you found this story, dear listeners, if it reached you across whatever distance you are carrying today, wherever you are watching from, I hope it gave you something that stays. Not just the romance, though the romance is worth having, but the other thing underneath it. The thing about knowing what you are and finding the world that was built for you to be it in. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Leave a comment telling me what moved you, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the thing watching over them from the tree line might be exactly what they think it is. Until next time, stay in the light. Epilogue. 1 year later, the High Council met in the Veldmere seat on a Thursday in November, a year and some months after the challenge session that had changed the shape of governance across 17 packs. And the meeting's agenda included, among its standard items, the quarterly report of the Vilethari Restoration Council, which Nora chaired and which had in the preceding year located and made contact. With 11 additional bloodline carriers across the 600-mile territorial range, all of them in various stages of the dormancy that 3 generations of suppression had created. All of them, upon contact and context and the beginning of understanding, showing the same response she had shown. Not surprise exactly, but the relief of a thing returning to its own shape after being held in a shape that was never right. She presented the report with the directness she had developed for council work, neither performing confidence she did not feel nor minimizing the conclusions, and the council received it with the engagement of a body that had, over the preceding year, come to understand that the Vilethari restoration was not a threat to the governance structure, but its oldest and most functional component, restored. There were still members who were cautious, and members who were skeptical, and 1 or 2 who remained opposed, and she expected this to be true for years yet. Because the restructuring of a system that had been stable for 3 generations was not achieved by a single session or a single year, regardless of how well the evidence pointed in one direction, and she had made her peace with the timeline, in the same way she had made her peace with most things, which was by understanding it clearly and deciding to do the work anyway. Aldrich had resigned from the council in the spring. He had done so without drama, citing health reasons that were plausible, enough to serve as cover for the real politique underneath, and she had watched him leave without satisfaction or relief. Only the clinical observation that the faction he had led was now without its organizing intelligence, and would take time to reconstitute around someone new, which was time available for the consolidation of what had been built. She was not a person who took pleasure in defeat. She was a person who noted it and moved on to the next phase of the work. After the meeting, she walked out onto the steps of the council building into the November air, and Cassian fell into step beside her with the ease of people who have stopped negotiating the logistics of being alongside each other, because it is simply where they are. And they walked down toward the mountain road in the failing afternoon light without needing to discuss where they were going, which was back to the Valley House first, and then, that weekend, back up to the cabin for the season, where the woodpile would need restocking, and the porch would need its winter preparation, and the tree line would stand in its silent old patience, waiting for them to arrive. She said, 11 more. He said, it will be more than 11 by spring. She said, I know. She walked a few more steps. My grandmother would have loved this. He said, "Tell me something about her." She said, "She made very good bread." She never explained recipes. She just made them while you watched and expected you to absorb it. She had a way of being in a room that made the room feel like it had been waiting for her to arrive. She paused. She would have figured you out very quickly and told you so, and you would have found it either alarming or refreshing, and I genuinely cannot predict which. He said, "Refreshing. I am reliably alarmed by very little." She said, "She would have tested that." He said, "Good." She laughed, the real kind, the kind she had now enough practice with to recognize as characteristic of herself, rather than as an event, and the sound of it moved across the mountain air and was absorbed by the old stones and the old trees and the November sky, and the mountain, which remembered everything and kept most of it, held this too. They were the threshold, and the sovereign, and the long work ahead of them, and the evening coming in from the west. And they were also, simply, two people walking toward a car at the end of a good day. And both things were entirely true, and neither one required the other to be less true for it to be exactly enough.